Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Warlords of Draenor dungeon guide. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at one of the new Warlords of Draenor dungeons, and this is the Shadowmoon Burial Grounds. Now this dungeon can be located within Shadowmoon Valley on the new continent of Draenor. If you'd like to skip to a certain boss in this dungeon, then please do use the on-screen annotations now in order to jump forwards in this video. Alternatively, if you'd like to view a written version of this guide, then head on over to flaskup.com or click on the link in the video description below. The first boss in this dungeon goes by the name of Sadana Bloodfury, and she's going to cast a range of shadow-based abilities at your party in order to try and bring you down and stop you from progressing any further in this dungeon. The first ability that you're going to have to deal with in this dungeon goes by the name of Death Spike, and this is one mainly for your healer and your tank to deal with, and this causes Sadana to cast 3 more subsequential attacks on the tank, dealing a high amount of shadow damage when she actually attacks. So when she attacks, she's got a chance to attack 3 more times, which deals quite a bit of damage to your tank. Your tank will simply need to use a cooldown, or your healer use a cooldown on your tank in order to try and negate some of the damage that this ability will deal. Throughout the fight, Sadana will also cast an ability called Whispers of the Dark Star, which will periodically inflict shadow damage to everyone in the party every second. Again, this is something that your healers simply got to deal with and needs to heal players up through, and you should look to use cooldowns as and when need be, or if you've got a healer in your group that's good at AoE healing, such as a Restoration Druid, then try and stack up in order to AoE heal and maintain high group healing. Her next ability is going to be randomly targeted on players within the group and goes by the name of Daggerfall, and this will cause her to spawn a shadowy dagger above a player, and it will begin to fall down to the ground at that player's location. You simply want to move away from the dagger's location as fast as possible, as it will deal a very high amount of shadow damage when it lands, and then it will also deal pulsating damage to anyone that is within 4 yards of it when it is in the ground. You obviously want to try and be aware of where you are positioning these as much as possible, because you want to leave yourself some room to move around in throughout the rest of the fight. Sadana is also going to cast an ability called Dark Communion, which will cause her to spawn a spirit which will fall down from the ceiling, and it will be linked with her. Now this spirit will start to move towards her, and you simply need to kill it off before it does reach her, as it will heal her and also increase her damage done. DPS players can use abilities such as slows, stuns and snares in order to slow down the spirit and make it take longer to actually reach Sadana and give you more time in order to kill it off. And her final ability is called Dark Eclipse, and this will simply cause her to spawn an eclipse over the room that will deal a very high amount of lethal damage to everyone that is in your party. Now thankfully she hasn't really thought this ability through, because when she does spawn the Dark Eclipse, little orbs of lunar purity will spawn, and these are little white circles that you can see on the ground, and if you stand in these, you will decrease your damage taken by 80%, meaning you're not going to die to the lethal damage of Dark Eclipse. You'll notice there's several of these lunar purity orbs around the room, but multiple players can stand in one orb, so you don't need to worry too much about taking one each or something along those lines. Your healer will still need to heal through the 20% damage of Dark Eclipse that you're going to take. The second boss in this dungeon goes by the name of Nhallish, and throughout this fight he's going to periodically banish players into a shadow realm in order to try and kill you off, as well as raising spirits to attack people and calling down blasts of void energy to try and blow you up. He's a lovely guy really. The first ability you're going to have to be aware of in this dungeon goes by the name of Planar Shift. Now this ability doesn't actually damage or affect any players in any way, as it will simply cause him to teleport and position himself in a place where he could cause issues with his next abilities. Now the next ability is called Void Vortex, and this will cause him to cast a channeled vortex for 6 seconds, which will cause him to simply pull you in towards him in order to deal high amounts of damage. If you are getting pulled in by the vortex, you're going to take ticking shadow damage each second, and if you get pulled into the center, you'll take a high amount of shadow damage. The easy way to counter this is to use speed increasing abilities, or just running away, in order to make sure you don't reach the center, and you can actually outrun the Void Vortex zone in order to not get pulled in at all. The next ability you're going to have to be aware of, and this is mainly for your tank, goes by the name of Void Blast, and this is a 3-second channeled ability that will cause him to do a frontal cone attack, inflicting a very high amount of shadow damage every second. Simply make sure that you're not standing in front of Nhallish when he does cast this, or make sure that your tank is positioning him away from the party so that he's not spraying his Void Blast over everyone and dealing 100,000 shadow damage every second. Your healer is not going to have fun if you end up doing that. Throughout the fight, he's going to cast an ability called Void Devastation, which will cause him to spew out shadow bolts and create a range of little purpley shadow void zones on the ground. Now, these void zones are actually marked on the ground before the shadow bolts do land, so you've got plenty of time to move away from the location before you take any form of damage. You should also make sure that once the void zones have spawned on the ground, you don't walk back into them. As standard, don't stand in the fire, despite it being shadowy fire. Mechanics do apply here. And the final ability you're going to have to deal with in this fight goes by the name of Soul Shred, and this will cause Nhallish to rip your soul from your body and phase you into a slightly blurry version of the room where you fight him, along with a hostile version of yourself. Now during this time, the hostile version of yourself doesn't actually deal damage to you, it just runs around feared. What you will be taking damage from is the ability Soul Shred, and this will cause you to take damage every 1 second for the whole 20 seconds that you're within the actual soul shredded realm. Now the idea here is to kill off the hostile version of yourself as soon as possible, and ideally you've got 20 seconds as a maximum time in order to kill it off. If you do kill it off, then you can click on the little soul that is left behind and you will get granted a returned soul buff, which will increase all your damage and healing done by 40% for 20 seconds, which is quite a nice little increase. If you don't kill your spirit, then you'll simply be teleported back without any form of damage increase, and that is if you don't die to the ticking damage that you'll be taking every second. Again, you need to remember that if you do kill off your spirit, you will need to interact with it by right-clicking it in order to be returned back to the non-blurry version of the room where you can attack the boss. The third and penultimate boss in this dungeon goes by the name of Bonemaw, and he's going to try and spray your raid with deadly abilities and also slam his face into the ground because he's a big worm and he can do that in order to try and kill players off. The first ability that healers are going to need to be aware of throughout this encounter goes by the name of Corpse Breath, and this is simply going to cause Bonemaw to deal damage to everyone in the party every second. Now, if you do have AoE healing again, it is ideal to stack up and heal through this damage as it can hit quite hard on the heroic mode version of this fight. Bonemaw's next ability goes by the name of Fetid Spit, and this means that throughout the fight there must always be someone within melee range of the boss, otherwise he will go a little bit crazy and begin casting this Fetid Spit ability at everyone in the party and dealing high amounts of damage to them. So make sure there's always someone in melee range, and tanks do count for this, so if you do have a party of ranged players, just make sure your tank is always in range of the boss. The next ability you should be aware of goes by the name of Necrotic Pitch, and this will cause Bonemaw to spawn a little puddle of dead stuff on the ground, and if you stand in it, you will take damage and also have your movement speed reduced by 75%, so naturally you want to move away from it. However, there is one exception, and this is when Bonemaw begins to cast his Inhale ability. And what Inhale will do is it will cause you to be pulled towards Bonemaw, and if you get pulled to him, then you'll take a high amount of damage and also be thrown off the platform into the water. Now in order to get around this, you can actually stand in the Necrotic Pitch zones on the ground in order to not move anywhere when Inhale gets cast. So this is the one time for all of these dungeons I'm going to say that standing in the bad stuff is a good idea at one certain point in the fight, so do keep that in mind. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this boss, Bonemaw is going to periodically slam his head into the ground with an ability called Body Slam. Now, this will deal a very high amount of damage to anyone that gets hit by it, as well as knocking them back, so you simply need to move away from this when he does cast it. The area where he's going to slam his head has got a massive purple void zone there, so you should be able to see it hours before it actually lands and not actually get hit by it. Now throughout the fight, you'll also find that Bonemaw will retreat into the water, and then he'll also come back out. And when he does this, he will also spawn several carrion worms, which are like little baby Bonemaws basically. Again, these have the ability Body Slam, which you simply need to avoid, and you can kill these off if you want to, but we found that he only seems to do this when he's almost dead, so you might as well just focus your damage onto Bonemaw himself. It's worth noting that they do also have the ability Fetid Spit, so you do want to make sure that there is someone in melee range of them as well, and with the way they spawn, your tank can normally be the closest person to them without any troubles. And the final boss in this dungeon goes by the name of Ner'zhul, and some of you will recognise this name as he is meant to be one of the many powerful warlords of the Warlords of Draenor. But unfortunately, he's at the end of a decent dungeon, I'll give him that, but he's only got 3 abilities, and the fight is a little bit lackluster for someone of such warlordish power. Now his first ability is called Malevolence, and this will be cast in front of him as a frontal cone ability, and anyone that gets hit by it is going to take a fatally high amount of damage and also have your damage dealt reduced by 50% if you happen to survive it. Again, this is another massive purple void zone in front of a boss situation, and you should be able to move from this without taking any damage. The next ability you're going to have to deal with is going to be targeted onto specific players, so a bit like on the first fight, and then you're simply going to have to move away from it in order to not take any additional damage. And this ability goes by the name of Omen of Death. Now, this is going to spawn a purple void zone under a player, as I've just mentioned, and when it does spawn, it will deal a moderate amount of damage, and then it will deal damage based on how far away you are from it, and the further away you are, the less damage you're going to take. It's quite simple, really. And the final ability you're going to have to deal with during this encounter has the potential to actually kill everyone in your party within an instant if it's not dealt with in the correct manner, as I'm sure many groups have already found out. And this ability is called the Ritual of Bones. Now this ability is going to cause Ner'zhul to summon an army of shadow and death, which is nicely put, that will span the width of the platform that you are fighting him on, and it will slowly begin to move from one side to the other. Now within this little wall of death, there are little skeletal adds which you're able to target, and what you simply need to do is decide on which one your party is going to kill, either by marking it with a skull or deciding beforehand as a group, and you just need to focus that one add down in order to kill it off and create a break in the wall that's moving towards you. This will then create an opening that you can stand in or move through in order to be safe as the wall goes past you. It is worth noting that he has been known to cast Malevolence while you are killing the wall or moving through the wall, so you will need to be aware of your positioning and where the abilities are actually being cast as you are moving about. So that's going to do it for this Warlords of Draenor dungeon guide. Hopefully you make your way through this dungeon without too many troubles and get yourself some nice shiny loot in order to progress within the Warlords of Draenor expansion. If you would like to view a written version of this guide instead of listening to me again, then please do head on over to flaskup.com and just hover over the little Dungeons tab that's at the top of the page, or there's a link which will take you directly to the written guide for this boss in the video description below. If you are interested in future dungeon guides or raiding guides as and when the raids do open up, then please do feel free to subscribe to the channel. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.